When a person loses someone they love, life can feel as if it's suddenly divided into two parts, before and after. For Aisha, that line was drawn on a quiet winter morning when her husband, Imran, failed to return home. He had been a healthy man in his early 30s, strong in his convictions, devoted to his family, and the kind of father who would rush home from work just to catch his children's laughter before bedtime. But fate has a way of testing people in the harshest ways. An unexpected heart attack stole him away, leaving Aisha a widow in her late 20s, and leaving their two children, little Zara and young Hamza, without the father who had once been their world. The funeral was overwhelming. Relatives, neighbors, and family friends filled the courtyard, whispering condolences, their eyes shifting between sympathy and curiosity. Some spoke kind words, others murmured judgments too low to be heard clearly, but loud enough to sting. Aisha sat quietly, holding her daughter's tiny hand, her son's head resting on her lap. She didn't cry loudly. Her grief was a quiet storm, one that churned inward, collapsing her strength from within. But amidst the blur of faces, there was one group whose presence felt heavier than the rest: her husband's family. Imran had come from wealth. His parents, his elder brothers, and their wives lived in a sprawling ancestral home that carried the weight of generations of inherited fortune. Land, businesses, and properties were all tied to their family name. Though Imran himself was not ostentatious, he worked in a managerial post, drawing a good income. There was always comfort in knowing that his family's fortune provided an additional layer of security. Aisha had never been materialistic, and Imran had always assured her that he had set aside savings and had left her and the children a rightful share in his family estate. But when death arrived, so too did greed, stepping out from behind polite smiles. At first, Aisha's in-laws surrounded her with gestures that looked like support. Her mother-in-law stroked her head. Her father-in-law patted her shoulder with a heavy sigh, and her brothers-in-law spoke of how the family will always be there. Yet beneath these words was something colder. It wasn't spoken aloud, not immediately, but it began to show itself in subtle ways, like the way they took over Imran's documents, how they discouraged her from asking questions, how they suggested she move back with her own parents for her comfort. Aisha, though soft-spoken, was not naive. She knew her husband had investments, shares, and a portion of the family property that legally belonged to her and the children. But whenever she raised her voice, even gently, she was met with deflection. One brother-in-law would wave his hand and say, "These matters are too complicated for you." Another would insist, "We will take care of everything. You don't need to trouble yourself." What they really meant was, stay silent and don't ask for what is yours. Her savings were quickly drained. The account that Imran had maintained seemed to shrink overnight. Cheques bounced. When she inquired, her father-in-law explained with a cold practicality that debts had to be paid, that there were expenses she couldn't understand. Aisha felt herself being slowly pushed out of her husband's financial legacy, as if she and her children had no place in it. Her own parents were supportive, but they were modest people. Her father was a retired schoolteacher, her mother a homemaker. They welcomed her back into their small home when the pressure from her in-laws became unbearable. But living with them, Aisha knew she couldn't rely on their limited means. She had children to raise, futures to protect, and she could not allow them to grow up as if they had been erased from the inheritance of the man who had loved them. The early years were the hardest. Aisha took whatever work she could find. She had studied only until her college degree, but she was determined. She began tutoring neighborhood children, stitching clothes for a local boutique, and later, when she gained confidence, she found a job at a private school as a junior teacher. Every rupee she earned was stretched thin, but she managed. She walked Zara and Hamza to school in the mornings, prepared simple meals, and often stayed up late correcting students' papers or sewing clothes by the dim light of a lamp. Through it all, she said little about the betrayal of her in-laws. She knew her children were too young to carry the bitterness of what had happened. She wanted them to grow up innocent, not poisoned by resentment. Yet she never forgot. Each sleepless night reminded her of the life stolen from her, of the wealth that could have eased her children's lives, but was hoarded by those who wore the mask of family. Years passed. Zara grew into a graceful young woman, intelligent and resilient, inheriting her father's thoughtful nature. Hamza, on the other hand, carried both his mother's determination and his father's quiet strength. They were children who understood struggle, who learned to value hard work and education, who grew up watching their mother sacrifice comforts so they could have opportunities. Aisha never remarried. She poured all her energy into raising them, finding fulfillment in their progress. Meanwhile, the wealthy in-laws lived as if nothing had happened. They expanded their businesses, built new homes, and married off their own children in lavish ceremonies. On the rare occasions that Aisha and her children crossed paths with them, the exchanges were polite but distant. Aisha was treated as though she had been a temporary guest in their family, someone whose ties had ended the moment Imran's body was lowered into the earth. But Aisha was patient. She knew time has a way of shifting the ground beneath even the most powerful people. She also knew that the past never truly disappears. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And in her quiet strength, she began preparing, not loudly, not with open threats but silently, with the endurance of someone who understands that revenge, to be most effective, is best served calmly and deliberately. She encouraged her children to study hard, not only for their own survival, but also because she knew education would be their strongest weapon. She guided Zara toward law, seeing in her a sharp mind and an instinct for justice. Hamza, with his natural aptitude for numbers, was encouraged into finance. They didn't fully understand at first why their mother insisted so strongly, but they trusted her, and they grew into their chosen fields with discipline. By the time Zara was in her final years of law school, and Hamza was interning at a financial firm, they began to notice their mother's lingering tension whenever the topic of their father's family arose. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Hamza finally asked the question that had lived silently between them for years. "Mother, what really happened after father passed away? Why did we never receive anything from his family?" Aisha looked at her children for a long moment. She saw in their faces the maturity she had been waiting for, the strength to carry a truth that once would have been too heavy. And so, with a steady voice, she told them everything. She spoke of the wealth Imran had left behind, the documents taken from her, the dismissive words of her in-laws, and the way they had erased her and her children from the family inheritance. She didn't speak with anger or tears. She spoke as someone who had carried a quiet truth for too long and was finally setting it down. Zara clenched her fists, her jaw tightening as the injustice sank in. Hamza's expression darkened, his usual calm giving way to a determined silence. "They robbed us," Zara whispered. Aisha placed a hand on hers and said gently, "Yes, but we will not lower ourselves to anger. Our revenge will not be loud. It will be calm, deliberate, and undeniable. Just as they thought we were too weak to fight, they will learn that patience is stronger than greed." From that moment, a silent pact was formed. The years of endurance had brought them to this point. The plan did not unfold in a day or even in a year. It was something that required careful steps, quiet investigation, and unshakable discipline. Aisha knew that time had finally ripened, that the seeds of patience she had planted in her children were ready to bear fruit. Her in-laws, still basking in wealth, had no idea that the widow they had dismissed decades ago was now quietly assembling the pieces of a plan that would expose not only their greed, but also the hidden cracks in the empire they thought unshakable. And so, the first moves of revenge began, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with calm precision, like the first ripples in water before a storm announces itself. The revelation of the past did not erupt into an immediate war. Aisha had lived too long with patience to suddenly throw caution aside. Her children, however, burned with a new kind of fire. Zara's legal mind could not stop analyzing what had been done to them. Every memory her mother shared became, in her thoughts, a potential case study. Hamza, with his financial insight, began to wonder about the flows of wealth within his father's family, about the businesses they owned, and about the likelihood that some of their activities weren't as clean as they appeared to the world. Their pact was not made of rage. It was made of resolve. Aisha's words guided them. "We will not strike without certainty. We will not move until we know the truth is on our side. And when we do act, It will not be with shouts or violence. It will be with quiet steps that cannot be undone. The first step was information. Zara, still a law student but already interning at a small legal firm, used her growing network to discreetly access records. She learned how to search property registries, inheritance filings, and corporate ownership documents. What she found confirmed her mother's story. Imran had indeed been entitled to a significant share of land, businesses, and dividends. His name had appeared on official documents up until the months following his death, and then, suddenly, his shares were transferred away. His properties redistributed, and in some cases his name was erased altogether, as if he had never existed in the financial fabric of the family. When she showed her findings to Aisha, there was no dramatic reaction. Just a calm nod. "This is the foundation," Aisha said. "But foundations alone do not topple walls. We must find the cracks." Hamza began observing the businesses from the outside. The family had expanded into multiple ventures: construction, textiles, import-export. They flaunted their successes at gatherings, speaking of profits and opportunities. But Hamza's sharp eye picked up on inconsistencies, inflated claims, sudden expansions that seemed unexplainable, and an unusual reliance on cash transactions in some sectors. He began to keep records, noting dates, numbers, and public filings. Slowly, a picture emerged, one that suggested not only greed, but also possible fraud. The siblings shared their findings with their mother each evening, their small dining table transforming into a quiet war room. Documents, photocopies, and notes were spread across its surface, each piece fitting into a puzzle that only they were beginning to see. Aisha listened carefully, guiding their impulses with the patience of her years. "We must be sure," she would remind them. "A half-truth will only make them stronger. The full truth will leave them defenseless." Months turned into a year of careful observation. Zara, now a licensed lawyer, had begun her career with quiet determination. She built her reputation on diligence, often taking on cases others dismissed as minor. Her persistence earned her the respect of her seniors and the trust of clients. She learned the art of presenting facts not with noise, but with precision, the very skill she would later use against her own family. Hamza's career advanced as well. His talent for financial analysis landed him a role in an auditing firm, where he gained first-hand experience in identifying irregularities. Each skill he acquired, he knew, was sharpening the tools he would one day turn toward his own blood. During this time, Aisha never once encouraged hatred. She reminded her children often, "We are not here to destroy for the sake of destruction. We are here to restore what was taken, to reveal what was hidden, and to show them that greed has consequences." Her calm tone kept them anchored, preventing their anger from overwhelming the patience required for their plan. Eventually, the evidence they collected grew into something undeniable. Zara had compiled a series of property documents showing illegal transfers made after Imran's death. Some bore forged signatures, others bore dates that did not align with official registries. Hamza had uncovered financial discrepancies, business accounts that hid undeclared income, investments that were siphoned through shell companies, and loans taken against properties that had technically never belonged to the borrowers. But exposure required strategy. Charging directly into court would alert the family, giving them time to manipulate evidence or exert influence. Aisha insisted they wait, that they choose their moment with precision. Revenge that comes too early gives the enemy time to prepare. Revenge that comes too late loses its weight. We must strike when they least expect, when they feel safest. That moment arrived sooner than expected. One of Aisha's nephews, the son of her eldest brother-in-law, was preparing for his wedding. The family planned a grand celebration, inviting politicians, businessmen, and community leaders. It was not just a wedding. It was a display of wealth and power. The event would be covered in local newspapers, with every detail meant to showcase their status. Aisha saw opportunity in their arrogance. She encouraged Zara and Hamza to prepare quietly for this occasion. When people gather to witness glory, they are also there to witness downfall. Their pride will be their weakness. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Zara arranged meetings with trusted senior lawyers. She carefully shared the documents, framing them not as personal grievances, but as cases of fraud and forgery. Hamza, on his side, reached out to investigative journalists through contacts in his firm. He didn't reveal everything, but he hinted at stories of corruption hiding beneath the surface of a wealthy family's empire. The journalists were intrigued. Wealthy families falling from grace always drew attention. Meanwhile, Aisha maintained her outward calm. She attended the pre-wedding gatherings with a composed smile, speaking politely to relatives who still looked at her as an outsider. She dressed modestly, avoiding any sign of resentment, so that no one could suspect the storm quietly forming beneath her silence. The night of the wedding arrived, grander than anyone had anticipated. Strings of lights draped across the family's mansion, music filled the air, and guests arrived in cars that lined the street. Inside, laughter and congratulatory speeches echoed. The family beamed with pride, unaware that in the background, journalists were preparing their stories, legal notices were being finalized, and documents were already finding their way into the hands of anti-corruption officials. Zara and Hamza played their roles flawlessly. They mingled with cousins, greeted uncles, and offered polite smiles. Yet their eyes never stopped observing every ostentatious display of wealth, every careless boast of profits. It all served as a reminder of what had been stolen, and of the justice that was now on its way. Aisha, seated quietly among the women, looked around at the glittering hall. She saw the jewels, the laughter, the towering wedding cake. And yet she felt no envy. She only felt a calm certainty that this empire of greed was about to face the weight of truth. The first tremor came 2 days after the wedding, when local newspapers published investigative reports questioning the legality of certain business deals linked to the family. The articles did not mention Aisha or her children. They did not need to. The facts alone were damning. Soon after, legal notices arrived, demanding explanations for property transfers made after Imran's death. The family, caught off guard, scrambled to contain the situation. Behind the scenes, Zara and Hamza watched with quiet satisfaction. They had not yet revealed their full hand. This was only the beginning. The family still believed they could manage the storm with their influence. What they did not realize was that the storm was not external. It was being guided by the very people they had once dismissed as powerless. Aisha reminded her children to stay calm. "This is only the first ripple," she said softly. "We will not rush. We will let the tide rise slowly until it carries them away completely." And so, as the walls of arrogance began to show their cracks, Aisha and her children prepared for the next stage of their plan. They knew the battle was far from over. The in-laws were wealthy, connected, and capable of striking back. But Aisha also knew that greed leaves trails, and trails always lead back to the truth. The silence of years was finally breaking, not with noise, but with the steady, inevitable weight of justice closing in. The storm had begun with whispers in newspapers and cautious inquiries from lawyers. But now, it was turning into something the family could no longer ignore. For decades, they had relied on wealth, reputation, and connections to silence questions. They believed themselves untouchable, too powerful for consequences. Yet greed, like cracks in stone, had weakened their foundation, and Aisha knew that time and patience were finally revealing the truth. The weeks following the wedding brought escalating tension. Notices continued to arrive from regulatory offices. Bank accounts that had once moved freely were suddenly flagged for review. Business partners, afraid of becoming entangled in scandal, quietly withdrew or demanded explanations. Even within the family, arguments broke out. Brothers accusing one another of carelessness, wives whispering about reputational damage, sons questioning their father's decisions. And amidst this chaos, Aisha remained quiet. She continued her daily routines as if nothing extraordinary was happening. She tended to her small garden, cooked simple meals, and exchanged warm words with neighbors. To the outside world, she was the same modest widow she had always been. But behind closed doors, her dining table was no longer just a war room. It had become a command center for justice. Zara now held a case file thick enough to rival those of major legal battles. She had gathered property records, forensic reports of forged signatures, testimonies from clerks who had processed questionable transfers, and even expert analyses confirming the manipulation of dates on inheritance papers. Every page was a weapon, and she prepared them carefully, knowing that when presented in court, they would not simply raise suspicion, they would prove fraud beyond doubt. Hamza, meanwhile, had worked quietly with investigative auditors. He traced hidden accounts, discovered undeclared assets, and uncovered a pattern of tax evasion so wide that it bordered on criminal. He was cautious, sharing findings only with professionals he trusted, ensuring that the evidence could not be discredited. Every financial misstep of the family was documented, every concealed transaction brought into light. The timing was deliberate. Zara filed the first formal case just as one of her uncles sought a large government contract for their construction business. The petition accused the family of forgery and illegal appropriation of Imran's share of the estate. Public records were cited, signatures were questioned, and the matter quickly attracted legal attention. The family expected the petition to be dismissed, but to their shock, the court admitted it for hearing. On the same morning that the petition became public, a second blow arrived. A leading newspaper published a detailed investigative piece based on Hamza's work with auditors. The headline spoke of financial shadows behind a prestigious business family. Names were not omitted. Dates, figures, and company records were all laid bare. The combination of legal and financial exposure shook the family's carefully built facade. Inside their mansion, panic spread. The brothers who once sat proudly at the head of their dining table now argued like cornered men. One accused another of forging documents. Another blamed a nephew for leaking information. Their wives fretted over their children's reputations. They made frantic calls to lawyers, politicians, and friends in high places. But no matter how many calls were made, the facts did not change. The tide had shifted, and it was not one they could easily turn back. For Aisha, it was not about watching them crumble. It was about finally seeing balance return. She had lived through years of silence, never allowing her bitterness to poison her children. And now, she watched as justice unfolded, not with vengeance that destroys blindly, but with calm exposure of truth. The first court hearing was a moment Aisha would never forget. She walked into the courthouse beside Zara and Hamza, both dressed professionally, their confidence quiet but firm. Across the aisle sat her in-laws, their expressions tense, their lawyers attempting to mask the weakness in their case. When Zara stood to present the opening arguments, her voice was steady. She did not shout. She did not accuse wildly. She laid out the facts, how documents were altered, how transfers occurred without legal heir's consent, how the widow and her children had been systematically excluded from their rightful inheritance. She spoke with the clarity of someone who knew not just the law, but the pain behind it. Every word carried the weight of years her mother had endured in silence. The defense tried to dismiss her as a young lawyer with personal bias. But Zara anticipated this. She had prepared supporting documents from independent sources, official registries, and expert verifications. Each counter-argument fell apart under the weight of evidence. The judge, attentive and impartial, allowed the case to proceed. The family could no longer sweep it under the rug. As weeks turned into months, hearings continued. More evidence surfaced. Witnesses who once feared speaking against the family now came forward, emboldened by the clear direction of the case. A former employee of the family business testified about being ordered to backdate documents. A bank officer revealed irregularities in loan approvals. Piece by piece, the fortress of wealth was stripped of its illusions. Parallel to the legal battle, tax authorities began their own investigation. Hamza's findings had triggered official scrutiny. Offices were raided, records were seized, and suddenly the family's empire did not look as secure as it once did. Even their social standing suffered. Invitations to elite gatherings grew scarce. Business partners distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by association. For the first time in decades, the family faced consequences not of fate, but of their own making. And through it all, Aisha never gloated. When neighbors whispered about the downfall of her in-laws, she remained composed. When relatives came to her quietly, asking if she was behind the exposure, she only smiled gently and said, "Truth has its own way of coming to light." She did not need to claim credit. Her revenge was not in being seen as victorious. It was in reclaiming what had been stolen, and in showing her children that dignity need not be sacrificed even in battle. The turning point came when the court issued an interim order recognizing that Aisha and her children had been wrongfully excluded from the estate. Properties were frozen until a final judgment could be reached. The family, once arrogant, now came forward with offers of settlement. They wanted to end the case quietly, to preserve what little reputation they had left. But Aisha refused to settle in the shadows. She had endured too long to accept partial justice. With Zara's guidance, she insisted on a full accounting of every asset that had belonged to Imran. It was not just about money. It was about restoring her husband's name, ensuring that his children were acknowledged as rightful heirs, and proving that silence does not mean surrender. Months later, the final verdict arrived. The court ruled decisively in Aisha's favor. Forged documents were nullified, property shares restored, and financial compensation ordered for years of denied inheritance. The judgment was not only a legal victory, it was a public declaration that greed had no place in family bonds. For the brothers and their families, the humiliation was profound. They had spent years building an image of wealth and honor, only to be unmasked by the very woman they had once dismissed as powerless. Their downfall was not loud, but it was complete. They remained in their mansion, but its lights no longer shone as brightly, its halls no longer echoed with pride. Every guest who visited now carried whispers of their disgrace. For Aisha, the victory was not about revenge in its rawest sense. It was about closure. She had raised her children through years of struggle, teaching them patience, integrity, and the value of justice. And now she saw them stand tall, not just as professionals, but as individuals who had carried her silent fight into a dignified resolution. The day the verdict was announced, Aisha returned home with Zara and Hamza. They placed the official documents on the dining table, the same table where for years they had shared meals of modest means, and later built their quiet plans. She looked at her children and said softly, "Your father would be proud." Zara smiled, tears in her eyes. Hamza nodded silently, the weight of their journey resting heavily on his shoulders. And in that moment, Aisha felt a peace she had not known since the day Imran had left her side. Justice had not erased her pain, but it had restored her dignity. Revenge had not been about hatred, it had been about balance. And in her calm, deliberate way, she had shown that greed may win in the short term, but truth, when pursued with patience, always finds its way to the surface. As the sun set that evening, Aisha stood at her window, watching the world outside move on. Life had come full circle. She had not only reclaimed what was hers, but had also taught her children the power of perseverance. And so, her story was not just of revenge, but of resilience. A reminder that family bonds broken by greed leave scars, but also that those scars can give birth to strength. If you've stayed with me through this journey, I hope you felt the quiet strength in Aisha's story. If you believe in the power of calm justice, I invite you to support this channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more stories where patience and truth turn the tide against betrayal.